Heart disease is a leading cause of death globally. The most common form of heart disease is coronary heart disease, a condition affecting the blood vessels that supply the heart. In 2008, around 7.3 million people died from this condition. We are told that high cholesterol levels are a major risk factor for coronary heart disease.
Stop any person on the street, including children, and ask them what causes heart disease. They'll tell you. They know the word cholesterol. It's quite a complicated chemical word, and children already know it from a very young age.
We now seem to worry about cholesterol levels as much as heart disease itself, and a new disease known as hypercholesterolemia has emerged.
In the United States, it's part of a yearly ritual to get your cholesterol level managed, and you think that your cholesterol level is like your overall grade on your future health.
The focus on cholesterol has also led to a global cholesterol-lowering industry that generates billions of dollars each year for pharmaceutical companies and food manufacturers.
You just can't get away from high cholesterol.
More than 40 million people now take medications known as statins to lower their cholesterol levels.
Statins have become one of the most widely prescribed categories of drugs in medical history.
These are the #1 profit makers for the pharmaceutical industry. These are the darlings of the pharmaceutical industry. This is their babies.
However, a number of doctors and researchers have for decades been questioning the role cholesterol plays in heart disease.
People believe it to be true. They believe they've read it, they've read it, they've read it. It's not there. It's just non-existent.
And strong evidence exists to suggest that the benefits of statins have been exaggerated by pharmaceutical companies keen to increase their profits.
We are beginning to see now that a lot of the facts that we are given are actually somewhat manipulated.
Doctors are not trained in nutrition. They know no more than you do.
It's a very hierarchical world, medicine. International opinion leaders say it, the national opinion leaders agree. No one's going to stand up and go, well, I don't believe that.
This stands as organized crime, but there's a lot more money in this. And in fact, many, many more people get hurt.
Well, the idea that cholesterol saturated and or saturated fat causes heart disease, I mean, you can actually track this back to a chap called Virchow, who is still sort of renowned for certain other discoveries. He looked at people who died in accidents, and in autopsies looked at their arteries, found that they had thickenings in their arteries, had a look at them and decided that they were full of cholesterol. So up until 1917, no one even thought there was such a disease as heart disease, really. And it was only really after the Second World War when in America there appeared to be thousands and thousands of youngish, healthy men dropping dead of heart attacks that it really became an important issue.
Since the last war, nutrition has become a science, according to Dr. Keyes.
Ancel Keys was a well-known physiologist. As an advisor to the US Department of Defense during World War II, he formulated meals for combat soldiers that became known as K-rations. Keys was also the lead investigator of the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, a human starvation experiment involving 36 conscientious objectors. In 2011, a report published by the Associated Press revealed a number of unethical medical experiments had been conducted in the past in the United States. One of these experiments involved injecting 11 volunteers with malaria, then starving them for 5 days. One of the authors of this study was Ancel Keys. Ancel Keys is also regarded as the father of the diet-heart hypothesis, the idea that dietary saturated fat raises cholesterol levels and causes heart disease.
So cholesterol at the time was a convenient villain. We had this problem of atherosclerosis, a hardening of the arteries, and there was a great deal of pressure, a need really, to blame it on something.
A chap called Ancel Keys came along and said, I know what causes heart disease. Heart disease is caused by eating. Well, initially he said eating cholesterol, but he found that if you ate cholesterol, it had no effect on cholesterol levels. He then said, well, it must be saturated fat.
He drew a graph in which he showed 6 countries, the amounts of fats in calorie terms along the x-axis and the numbers of heart disease deaths in those countries, and he drew what was probably the most perfect graph you can get. It was a superb line, marvellous. There's a flaw. Because at the time that Keyes did this in 1953, there were data from 22 countries he could have used. He didn't use the 16 that didn't agree. And when you add those to his graph, there is no relationship at all. You find countries with much higher levels of heart disease eating less fat, and vice versa.
It was pure manipulating, or we could call it fraud. This is pure fraud.
Despite the obvious problems with this study, the work completed by Ancel Keys is still quoted today as evidence in support of the diet-heart hypothesis. Most authorities state that this straight-line relationship can also be seen between cholesterol levels and the risk of heart disease.
There is a clear, what's called a linear relationship, so it's a straight line between cholesterol levels and risk of heart disease, so there's no plateau. The lower your cholesterol levels in nature, the lower your rate of heart disease.
However, there are a number of contradictions to this idea that raised cholesterol levels increase the risk of heart disease.
Firstly, for example, the UK does not have a particularly high cholesterol level in comparison to most other European countries and possibly worldwide.
According to data published by the British Heart Foundation, average cholesterol levels for men in the UK are the 15th lowest on a scale of 45 European countries. Despite this, the UK has one of the highest rates of heart attacks. In addition, cholesterol lowering on a population level does not seem to help. Again, in the UK, the percentage of people with high cholesterol has reduced significantly since 1994. Some age groups now have almost 40% less people with high cholesterol. Yet the rate of heart disease has stayed the same. We have been led to believe that saturated fat and cholesterol simply clog up the arteries and cause a heart attack. But where did this idea come from? And does it have a scientific basis?
Certain foods are high in saturated fat.
There is an advertisement pushed out by the Food Standards Agency.
This is the average amount of saturated fat a person consumes in a month.
Where they show a woman taking what they say is saturated fat out of a fridge. She pours it down the sink and it blocks the sink waste pipe up. And then the advertisement says,
the saturated fat can clog this pipe. Imagine what it's doing to yours.
What they show in the adverts on television is as far from what actually happens as you can get, I should think.
You may have seen adverts where people had cigarettes and there was fat coming out the end of it.
We've all tried to give up smoking.
That's nonsense. It's utter nonsense. So how does fat, the non-existent fat from the cigarettes, end up in your arteries when you smoke? People have said that smoking increases the risk of heart disease. That's true. But when you smoke, other things happen.
What actually happens is not the inside of the artery getting blocked by anything. What happens is that the artery wall, called the endothelium, is broken in some way. And just like if you cut your finger, you get a scab form on top of it, which then falls off. A similar thing happens in the artery. You get the damage to the endothelium, repair mechanisms are all set into motion, all the building materials needed to repair that and form a scab are pushed there, which includes cholesterol, because that's a major building block for just about everything that goes on in the body. And then, because you can't afford to have a scab fall off in an artery, it would block it, the endothelium grows back over it, and it's subsumed into the artery wall. And that's what's called atherosclerosis. It's nothing inside the artery at all, it's actually inside the artery wall.
What you've got to look at is what's causing damage to the lining of the artery wall. Once you've damaged the lining of the artery wall, in a very simplistic way, those clots become covered up, the repair process pulls them into the artery wall, but they then become a focus for further development of damage. And if you want to know what causes heart disease, you have to look at things that damage the artery wall, interfere with the disease process, and cause increased blood clotting. That's really what you're looking at here.
When we have a cholesterol test, the results are usually described in terms of good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. The good cholesterol is called HDL and the bad cholesterol is called LDL.
What HDL and LDL are carriers. These molecules are made up of fats, proteins, certain vitamins, and other structural factors, and within them the cholesterol sits. So to a degree, the HDL and the LDL are transport mechanisms or little lorries that carry the cholesterol to the parts of the body that need them. And we've been given the idea that the high density lipoprotein is good for us and the low density lipoprotein is bad for us. But we also know that a lot of other things are carried. CoQ10, which is a specialized enzyme required in many different processes, but predominantly needed in mitochondria, which are the little batteries that live inside cells and give the cell energy to function in the way that it should. A cardiac muscle, a heart muscle, can have 2,000 or 3,000 mitochondria, and without CoQ10, the process of turning oxygen and sugar into energy is not going to function at an optimum. Beta-carotene, the more functional form of vitamin A in the body. We also know that vitamin E is carried by the HDLs and LDLs. And this is a very important vitamin because it's a powerful antioxidant.
Cholesterol-lowering medications, in particular statins, are prescribed to lower bad cholesterol levels. However, a large study published in the American Heart Journal in 2009 found that the level of so-called bad cholesterol is actually lower in people with heart disease, not higher. This study included around 137,000 people who had been admitted to hospital with heart disease. It included patients from 541 hospitals in the United States. All of these people had their LDL level measured within 24 hours of admission. The researchers found that the average LDL level for this group of people was actually lower than the average level for the American general population. The average level for people with heart disease was 104, and the average for the general population was 123. If people with heart disease have lower levels of so-called bad cholesterol, why are some countries around the world spending billions of dollars each year lowering these levels?
I think it's fair to say that we can't look at HDL or LDL and say that one is good and one is bad.
In fact, the studies now show that drugs that increase HDL have to be stopped because they increase the rate of heart attacks.
Well, the theory is false, but it's gained so much momentum and it's become so lucrative that it's almost like a freight train going down a hill.
And in fact, I find it interesting that exactly at the same time that Virchow was talking about his idea of cholesterol-causing heart disease, Rokitansky was proposing that these plaques are caused by blood clots on the surface of arteries. That was 1851. He was right, Virchow was wrong. It just so happens Virchow's idea took over the world, if you like.
It does seem that most countries around the world are in agreement about saturated fat and cholesterol being a major cause of heart disease. One country in particular, where the diet-heart hypothesis has been adopted, is Denmark, where the government have introduced a fat tax. This tax applies to foods, such as butter, that contain saturated fat. However, a short journey across the bridge to Sweden reveals a different attitude towards dietary fat.
In fact, there was a poll in Sweden recently. It showed that 20% of the Swedish population, they follow the low-carb, high-fat diet. And some places it's very difficult to get butter in the shops.
Dr. Uffe Ravnskov is an independent researcher based in Sweden. His articles and letters challenging the diet-heart hypothesis have been published in the most respected medical journals in the world.
We have succeeded in introducing this type of diet to the diabetic patients, a low LCHF diet. This low-carb, high-fat diet has been very popular in Sweden. Thousands of diabetic patients have reported on the internet that as soon as they started with this diet, the low-carb, high-fat diet, they improved immediately. In a few weeks, their body weight went down, their blood sugar normalized, they could skip their diabetic medicine, it wasn't necessary any longer to use insulin, and other complaints disappeared from these patients.
Humankind existed on this planet for eons, and for eons we prized the fatty foods, the fatty cuts of meat, the cream on the milk, the butter, the eggs, and the oily fish. You need to have 2 eggs minimum per day. if you have a cold, or if you have an exam coming up, or if you're depressed, or if there is some other trouble with brain function, memory, you need to eat 4 or 5 eggs per day to avoid heart disease and cancer and other degenerative conditions, to prevent them and to even reverse them, to remove them from your life. Revert back to the natural foods that we humankind used to eat for millennia.
We frequently forget that cholesterol is essential for life, and that a little higher cholesterol is associated with longevity, decreased malignancies, improved defense against infections. So when you lower cholesterol by any means, you can have adverse effects just from that.
Cholesterol is used in large quantities 24 hours a day for the whole of our lives in building and repairing cells. It's used to make hormones, it's used to make bile acids with which we digest fats, a whole range of things, including vitamin D.
So low cholesterol levels is going to muck around with your cell membranes, the ability of the cell membrane to allow things in and out. It's going to compromise the function of the nervous system, and it's going to stop the body from dealing with stress well. And I've only just touched upon a few of the issues, because cholesterol can mirror many other molecules in the body and has very similar attributes to, say, vitamin D.
There's a Honolulu heart health study looking at elderly males living in Hawaii and Honolulu, and they found that the lower your cholesterol level was, the earlier you died. There's a major study in Austria which showed that the lower your cholesterol levels were at any age, the younger you died. And there's almost no contradiction to this. If you have low cholesterol levels, you are likely to die younger.
Another way to investigate the causes of heart disease might be to look at the differences between different socioeconomic groups. People with a low income have a much higher risk of dying of heart disease. For example, in England, men in the lowest socioeconomic group are almost 3 times more likely to die of heart disease than men in the highest socioeconomic group. We might expect, therefore, that there are more people with high cholesterol in the lowest socioeconomic group. However, the reverse is true. The lowest socioeconomic group have fewer people with high cholesterol. Women in England, in the lowest socioeconomic group, are 5 times more likely to die of heart disease than women in the highest socioeconomic group, but have approximately the same number of people with high cholesterol. All of the experts agree that heart disease is a complex condition with several contributing factors. However, this data raises questions about the importance of high cholesterol. One potential risk factor not often mentioned relates to social support. People in the lowest socioeconomic group are more than twice as likely to indicate a severe lack of social support, a factor which could, of course, increase psychological stress. To find out how psychological stress can affect the heart, we went to New York to see Dr. Paul Roche. Dr. Roche is president of the American Institute of Stress, clinical professor of medicine and psychiatry at New York Medical College, and honorary vice president of the International Stress Management Association. We began by asking Dr. Roche if he could define what stress actually is.
Well, no. Simply because nobody's been able to do that. The term was coined by Hans Selye around 1936, who defined it as a non-specific response of the body to any demand for change. It really wasn't very helpful. He redefined it as the rate of wear and tear on the body. Well, that's a pretty good definition of aging, which stress certainly contributes to. He used to answer the question this way later on. Everybody knows what stress is, but nobody really knows.
So stress itself is difficult to define. But how might psychological stress from a lack of social support translate into an increased risk of heart disease?
Think about all the advances made in diagnostics with MRIs, SQUID, PET scanning, positive emission tomography. These are all advances that have nothing to do with cholesterol or something in the blood. These are all advances that are based on energy medicine. And that is the medicine of the future, and certainly the future for stress research, in my opinion. Medicine is entering a new paradigm. Good health depends upon good communication between the constituency of an organism and with the external environment. The question is, how does communication take place in the body? Well, we know there are hardwired connections with the central nervous system, and we know that the endocrine system sends out little chemical messengers from the brain and hormones and so forth and so on. But we visualize communication in the body at a chemical molecular level. We visualize that these little things that circulate around find receptor sites on cell membranes, that they communicate like keys into a lock. But ultimately, that signal is transmitted by a weak electrical impulse to the interior of the cell. And ultimately, all communication in the body takes place at a physical atomic level rather than a chemical molecular one. And now we understand now, for example, that the EEG waves, brain waves, are not merely the noise of the machinery of the brain, but they are signals being sent to receptor sites on cell walls for these subtle energies. And we know, for example, that the electromagnetic field around the heart is 5,000 times greater than the brain, and it extends out like 12 feet. And we can now show that that changes with your emotions. There's certain specific characteristics when you feel appreciative or warm or sensitive, and a very jagged thing if you're angry, etc. And you can see that reflected in the EEG of somebody if you touch them. Those factors have a very powerful influence on the heart. And again, it supports the role of emotions in heart disease, etc. And we're now able to measure that where we couldn't before.
It also appears that there are several other mechanisms to explain how stress in general could affect heart disease risk.
Stress can also produce myocardial necrosis, a heart attack, in patients who have no coronary atherosclerosis. Now, the conventional idea everybody was taught when we went to medical school, you had a clot in the vessel and no blood could get through and the myocardium died. But it doesn't work that way. You could have vessels completely occluded with atherosclerosis, and there's enough collateral circulation so that even at autopsy the vessel is closed. The patient has never had any symptoms or electrocardiographic changes because of collateral circulation. The converse is also true. You can have a myocardial infarction and sudden death due to acute stress in young, healthy patients with no atherosclerosis. You can talk to anybody with a heart condition or angina who'll tell you that when they're upset, they have chest pain, etc. And John Hunter, 19th century English physician who elevated surgery to a specialty from a mechanical trade, suffered from angina. And being a keen observer, he said, "My life is in the hands of any rascal who chooses to annoy me," which turned out to be a very accurate prediction because he died 2 weeks later during an argument with a colleague.
I'm taking the Uncle Toby's Oats Cholesterol Challenge for 6 weeks. Because eating Uncle Toby's Oats every day as part of a healthy diet can help lower cholesterol reabsorption. So join me in the Uncle Toby's Oats Cholesterol Challenge. Let's take it on!
The idea that saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease has led to a global cholesterol-lowering industry, an industry that generates at least $29 billion each year from medications and specially developed foods that lower cholesterol levels.
Alto el colesterol.
The majority of this relatively new industry is associated with a group of medications known as statins. One statin, Lipitor, generated more than $13 billion in 2006 for the pharmaceutical giant Pfizer. Some authorities have referred to statins as wonder drugs that save thousands of lives each year, and more than 40 million people now take them.
Statins have become one of the most widely prescribed categories of drugs in medical history, and so we know a lot about them.
Dr. Peter Langstjerne has been practicing cardiology since 1985. After 5 years of cardiology at the University of Texas Health Center, he set up a private cardiology practice in Tyler, Texas, where he has worked for the past 21 years. Since 1983, Dr. Langstjerne has been involved with the clinical application of coenzyme Q10. We asked Dr. Langstjerne to explain how statins work and how statins affect coenzyme Q10 levels within the human body.
They are a drug that blocks a biochemical pathway in all cells. Very high up in the pathway, it blocks the production of a compound called mevalonate. That's the precursor for many other compounds. When you block this pathway, you block the ability of cells to biosynthesize cholesterol. Well, there's many branches on this pathway. Think of it as a tree, and you're cutting it off at the trunk. All the branches will be affected. Not only do you lower cholesterol, you lower other compounds. One of those that we know a lot about is this coenzyme Q. So if you take a statin and you decrease cholesterol levels, let's say by 40 or even 50%, which they're capable of doing, you're going to have a 40 or 50% reduction in CoQ10. It's not avoidable. It's the same pathway. So cells that are active 24 hours a day, every day, very active, and that would be heart muscle cells. They don't rest day or night. They use a huge amount of energy, and therefore heart muscle has the highest concentration of CoQ10, by far.
We have the unfortunate effect, therefore, that by giving a statin to try and reduce cholesterol, we may well be blocking one of the most important molecules in the function of heart muscle. So in effect, while statins may be acting, they think, in a good way, we've got very ample evidence that by blocking CoQ10, we are probably raising the risk of heart muscle failure and therefore heart attacks from a different avenue other than arterial blockage.
Most drugs, if they're going to affect you adversely, you can tell it within a day. You swallow the pill and 30 minutes later you throw up or have diarrhea or have a rash, and then you know not to take it again. Statins are insidious because their side effects begin very gradually over a period of months to years.
My experience shows that statin side effects can be very subtle. They can involve other organ systems. They can present themselves months to maybe years after starting the statin, so it's not necessarily within a short time frame. And by that time, usually a patient gets diagnosed as having a whole new disease, and then they're put on a whole new drug.
For the first 11 years of her career, Dr. Catherine Faraday was a medical officer in the US Navy. She now specializes in dermatology and has a private practice in Austin, Texas.
I took Lipitor for 2 years, and I was fairly sick during that whole period of time. After I stopped taking Lipitor, it took me another 2 to 3 years to get to where I started to feel back to normal. Although most of my dramatic symptoms had gone away, I still had memory issues, which I still have to this day, and my energy levels took a long time to come back. I would be saying something to a patient, and then suddenly the next word would not come. In fact, my whole mind would go blank for a couple of seconds. It was like a whiteout. That was frightening. I didn't know what that was, and again I thought, well, maybe it's just stress. I've been working pretty hard, but at the back of my mind I started to fear that maybe I was starting to get early Alzheimer's. I couldn't say the word, but that was my fear. I went home and I stayed home for 3 weeks. I was totally exhausted and depleted, emotionally and physically. And all I could do was stay in bed. It was an effort to get out of bed. I was afraid to get out of bed. I've never been so fearful in my life. In fact, fear was the only emotion I had. I couldn't feel happiness. I couldn't laugh. I couldn't even remember being happy. That was the worst I'd ever felt in my life.
Didn't notice anything for about 6 months, and then started to get a lot of pain, muscle aches and insomnia, and I started to feel really genuinely unwell, as if I had flu. I started to keep a diary about statins because my memory loss was so bad. I thought I ought to write this down because no one's ever going to believe it. So I'll just read you a little bit about what I wrote in my diary at the time. I get lots of depression, light sensitivity, amnesia, unable to write, chest pains, leg pains, incredible fatigue, and some days I can't get my legs out of bed. Symptoms are getting worse, and I need to find out what's going on, as I think I am dying. It goes on and on and on like this, and it's quite scary actually, because I would never remembered any of this. I'm so glad I wrote it down, and I urge other people to write theirs down as well, write down what happened to them.
My friends sort of thought I was putting it on, and it weren't until we were up in Alicante actually with 4 of us having a stroll around Alicante. My walking started to get very tiring, tired legs, and I was having to stop and saying to them, look, you beat a lot, I'll catch up with you sooner or later, because I just couldn't keep up with them. But the memory thing, that's perhaps one of the worst facets of it. I was always sharp, very sharp as a razor. Like I said, I've been in business on and off all my life. I'd remember telephone numbers. You don't have to tell it, but I got it. Well, that's it, done. I wouldn't have to think about it. I could go away and think I'd forgotten it and stand there and think, oh yeah, that's it. And I'd have it right. Today I couldn't do that. It would be impossible.
I went to see my doctor, and I kept telling him I found it very difficult at work. I was forgetting lots and lots of things and not completing tasks. And he just said, oh, well, you're getting old. You know, we all do that. It happens to all of us when we get to this age. I was 51.
And it just got to the point where life was pretty near unbearable. Constant pain gets you, feeling not well gets you. Waking up in the morning, not feeling rested and thinking, oh, whoopee, another day. Waking up and thinking, oh, Christ, another day.
There were times when I wondered if I really wanted to go on living. I mourned my health. I felt that I had lost my health. And I felt sorry that I hadn't done things like travel and all those things you think you're going to do. And I felt so sorry that I hadn't done that before I'd lost my health. Now, as I'm trying to be healthy, I'm trying to get enough sleep, I'm trying to manage my stress levels, I'm trying to exercise regularly. My cholesterol continues to be very high. However, I've had several echocardiograms, stress tests, EKGs. Nothing's ever showed any evidence of heart disease. So far I'm doing okay.
When you stop statins, it takes a long while to get over. Some people get over it fairly quickly, but by and large, to feel any real relief takes, I would say, a minimum of a year, because that's how I'm starting to feel better. There's just so many of us now. We're all sharing the same symptoms.
I help moderate a group called Taking Lipitor and Hate It, and I've found out the damage that it's done to people like me and to millions of people around the planet.
The commonest side effect is one that you can't really quantify, which is myalgia. That's basically aching in the muscles. If you measure enzymes in the blood that look at muscle damage, you don't see any abnormality. They're relatively common. And in trials, interestingly, people that were given a dummy drug, so there's no active component, the rates of aching was exactly the same as in the population that had the statin. So, and that can occur in anything up to about 7% of people. If you look at significant muscle damage and complications thereof, the rates, depending upon which agent you use, are about 5 per 10,000 treated for a year, or with one drug, which now there have been warnings about at a particular dose, it's about 120 to 160 per 10,000 over a year.
The impression given is that they don't cause, or hardly any, side effects. I was involved partly in a study in Holland, where they asked 50,000 people how many people took statins, what were the side effects. They reckoned there was 30 to 35% of people got significant side effects. Other studies have shown 20%, some studies have shown less. But I personally believe it's in around 20% of people suffer significant adverse events.
I honestly don't believe that doctors do recognize statin side effects, even when they're sitting right in front of them. In the middle of my 2-year illness, I saw my internist for our annual check. After briefly noting that I was seeing several specialists for my dry eye problem, my arrhythmia problem, my colitis problem, and my depression, she then got to the heart of the visit, which was that she was delighted that my cholesterol levels were under control. I find it ironic that neither she nor I ever stopped to question why a relatively young, healthy person had suddenly developed 5 new illnesses in 1 year. And the only new thing in my life was Lipitor.
It's not only possible that GPs aren't reporting adverse effects, it's certain that they aren't. All studies done on reporting of adverse events around the world of drugs have shown that the average reporting varies between 1 to 5%. Most people think it's actually considerably less than that. I would think it's likely that about 1 in 200 adverse events are actually reported. Probably less.
Now we come to an even more serious problem, that is that low cholesterol predisposed to cancer. We have identified at least 11 studies where low cholesterol measured 15, 20, 30, 40 years previously was a risk factor for cancer. One of the most striking findings is made in Japan. Japanese researchers, they gave a small dose of simvastatin to about 40,000 patients and followed them for 6, 7, 8 years. And instead of having a control group, they looked at the cancer frequency in relation to their cholesterol. They measured the frequency of cancer in people with high cholesterol, medium cholesterol, and low cholesterol, all degrees of cholesterol. And they found that those with the lowest cholesterol, those who had achieved the lowest cholesterol value, they had 3 times more cancer cases in that group. There were 3 times more who had died from cancer in that group compared with those who still had normal cholesterol.
And we don't have good follow-up studies. In other words, let's say that somebody's been on statin for 5 years and they develop cancer. Who's to know that? Who's to say, well, you know, we better start looking at, there's no follow-up of that nature.
Clinical trials involving statins have shown that statin benefits vary depending on what is medically known as primary and secondary prevention.
We've had this thing in clinical studies called primary and secondary prevention. Primary prevention means people who have not, say, had a heart attack or a stroke or diagnosed heart disease or something like angina. There are secondary prevention means people who have had a stroke or a heart attack or diagnosed angina. Clinical trials have generally, in the past, been secondary prevention or high-risk patients, really, I suppose you call them, and primary prevention and low risk. So that's really the difference.
Dr. Malcolm Kendrick is a general practitioner who has been researching and challenging the diet-heart hypothesis for decades.
So what I'm really talking about is the development of the atherosclerotic plaque.
He has also worked with the European Society of Cardiology. We asked Dr. Kendrick how much life extension a person could expect to achieve from taking a statin.
You're asking a question of life extension, which is good, because most people say lives saved or prevention. These terms are relatively meaningless. What people want to know is, if I took a statin for 20, 30 years, which is what people are being told, or 40 years, or however long you think you're going to live for, how much longer could I expect to live? Which is what people want to know. But what we do know is in primary prevention, there is no life extension. There is no increase in life expectancy. Ergo, you won't live one day longer.
For primary prevention, it turns out that there is no reduction in mortality. There is no reduction in the rate at which people have serious health events. There is a reduction in the rate at which people have heart attacks, but the reduction in heart attacks is compensated for by other serious illnesses. And the net effect is that you haven't improved people's health.
You might change what's written on the death certificate, but you won't change the date. So primary prevention, no increase in life expectancy at all.
Professor Korzik Ray is a clinical cardiologist and professor of cardiovascular disease prevention.
In what we know from all the trial data that we've got, bearing in mind that some of the studies have followed people up for about 15 years now, but we don't have long-term follow-up data for many of our interventions. But if you look in a primary prevention population over 5 years, the extension in life over that short period of time is very modest.
Professor Ray was the lead author of a study published in the Archives of Internal Medicine in 2010 that investigated the effectiveness of statins. The conclusion of this study was that statins do not extend life expectancy when used for primary prevention. This is highly significant because primary prevention accounts for around 75% of all the people who take a statin. So what about the use of statins for people who already have a diagnosed heart problem?
In the secondary prevention population, you're going to gain many more years in the short term. We know that it will prolong life by a couple of years, even over about 5 years, 5 to 10 years or so, because their risk of having an event in that time period is much, much higher because they've already demonstrated they have a tendency to have these events.
At the end of the study, say there were 50 more people alive on the statin arm than the placebo arm. Yes, there may have been. However, if you extend those two lines, how long does it take before those 50 people are now dead? And the answer is a very short amount of time. So I've looked at this with statisticians working in the MRC and using a technique called restricted mean survival time, which does virtually the same thing. And what you find is in the secondary prevention studies, the two that are most quoted, the 4S study and HBS heart protection study, that if you took a statin for 5 years, that was the length of the trial themselves. You took a statin for 5 years, you could expect on average to live for 15 days longer. That's it, total.
Yes, I think you can say that statins reduce the risk or the likelihood of recurrent heart attacks in patients with a history of a heart attack or a history of severe coronary disease or surgical intervention for that. But that's a specific indication. There is absolutely no evidence that it has any role in primary prevention given to healthy people or even people at increased risk for heart disease because they have diabetes, that it has any protective effect.
If the benefits of statins have been exaggerated and cholesterol is not the risk factor we have been led to believe, why have so many doctors bought into the diet heart hypothesis? And how did we get into a situation whereby millions of people are being prescribed medications that could be doing more harm than good?
All right, so what's the truth here? Joining me now is Dr. John Abramson. He is on the clinical faculty at Harvard Medical School.
For more than 20 years, Dr. Abramson practiced family medicine. However, through his independent research, he began to notice an alarming trend within medicine. Dr. Abramson noticed that the scientific evidence was becoming increasingly influenced by commercial interests.
Yes, there's been a radical change in the way medical science is conducted. It coincided with President Reagan coming into office in 1980 in the United States. And he came in with a mandate to downsize government. One of the first things that got downsized was our National Institutes of Health, so that publicly funded research decreased considerably. And researchers who expected to fill out a grant for research in the public's interest suddenly weren't getting funded. And the only source of funding became the commercial interests, primarily the drug companies. When science is commercially funded, the odds are about 5 times greater, surprise, that the science will support the funder's product. So you have 5 times better odds of getting the result you want if you pay for the science.
We are told many, many facts throughout many, many years. And we are beginning to see now that a lot of the facts that we are given are actually somewhat manipulated by the pharmaceutical companies or by other vested interests, such as the food industry, to perhaps give us a flavour or an idea of the benefits of a treatment or a drug that aren't necessarily accurate.
Drug companies not only control the details of how the studies were set up, the protocols, and how the studies were conducted, but they own the research. And this is critically important. The research is done, the drug company compiles the data and processes the data. Peer reviewers read it and say whether it makes sense and the conclusions are justified by the data and so forth. But the real data is not available to the editors of the journal or the peer reviewers. They have to trust that that manuscript is a reasonable summary of the study that was conducted. And often that's not true. We're not talking about some minor details that are spun one way or another. We're talking about major infractions of science, major violations of scientific standards that are commonplace, and that's what doctors are not understanding.
It's a very hierarchical world, medicine. International opinion leaders say it, the national opinion leaders agree, and as it goes down, no one's going to stand up and go, well, I don't believe that. Who are you to say that? So unfortunately, we do have a hierarchical system of people who will generally just go along with what they're told.
If we have a quick look back over the history of some common names and common drugs, we can see that doctors frequently prescribe and then have to turn around and go, sorry, I prescribed on the best in your best interests and on the best advice I had, but I was wrong. Thalidomide, a drug used for anti-nausea, even though it was an anti-cancer drug in its development, but given to women in pregnancy, unfortunately causing deformities in their babies. Vioxx, a famous painkiller.
With Vioxx, a conservative estimate is that 40,000 Americans died of Vioxx, from taking Vioxx. That is close to the number of Americans that died in the Vietnam War, 55,000.
Another concern relates to the actual definition of high cholesterol. Just a few years ago, a total cholesterol level above 250 was considered high. But this threshold has now been lowered to 200. These guidelines originated from an expert panel of the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute in America and were adopted by several other countries. The lowering of the threshold, effectively changing the definition of high cholesterol, meant that millions more people became eligible for statin medications. This raised controversy because 8 out of the 9 experts on the panel had financial ties to the pharmaceutical companies that make statins. Although the guidelines were decided by a small number of doctors, they are followed by hundreds of thousands of doctors worldwide.
If they don't follow those and a heart attack happens, and heart attacks happen, those guidelines can be presented in court in a malpractice suit.
A doctor isn't necessarily the one who makes the decisions about the success or harm of a drug, but they prescribe it on the advice that they're given with the absolute best interests of the patient at heart.
And ordinary doctors ought to be brought in as stakeholders in these panels to decide what the evidence really shows. And having experts who have financial ties with drug companies is just like having judges that are getting paid by one of the litigants in a court battle to sit on the bench.
We have been told year by year that we should lower cholesterol even more and more and more. And where is the evidence? I haven't seen any evidence for that argument. The great problem is that these recommendations are written by people paid by the drug industry. How can anybody believe in such recommendations?
60-odd years have passed. And while the science was working, trying to prove the hypothesis, a big and very powerful and very wealthy political and commercial machine has grown on this hypothesis, based on this hypothesis. And this political and commercial machine doesn't want the hypothesis to die.
The level of propaganda and misinformation and even fraud in drug company-funded trials on statins is staggering.
This is World News with Charles Gibson.
The widely used drugs called statins, taken to lower cholesterol, could soon become much more popular.
These are the biggest reductions we've seen in heart attacks and strokes, and thus gives us the evidence we need to expand statin treatment to these new patients. People walking around not knowing that they have a risk of heart attack, and it could be reduced with statin treatment.
But yeah, let's talk about the Jupiter study. First of all, it was a very large study, and it was actually ended early after 1.9 years per person because it showed that it was saving so many lives, and it's really rare for a study to get stopped like that, especially because it has good events. I've read all the cholesterol medications, and I've never been this impressed.
Okay, very interesting.
It's really, it's pretty scary. I read it twice, and it's like, really? And it was a well-done study.
And in the Jupiter study, what we discovered was that in the statin arm of the study, after 2 years, the total number of cardiovascular deaths was 12. And this is a study of thousands of people. In the placebo arm of the study, the total number of cardiovascular deaths was 12. There was no difference. The only difference they found was actually there was less people in the statin arm who died of cancer, and that caused them to stop the trial. But in no other study on statins has this ever been shown. In fact, in other studies, the rate of cancer has been shown to be higher. So, you know, we have a study that's basically stopped for completely wrong reasons.
If the Jupiter trial was stopped for the wrong reasons, why were the results so enthusiastically reported in the media? For example, a 54% reduction in heart attacks was widely reported. In fact, this 54% was a relative risk reduction, which is technically correct, but extremely misleading. In the placebo group, 0.76% of people suffered a heart attack. In the statin group, it was 0.35%. 0.76 minus 0.35 is 0.41%. Therefore, in real terms, the risk of heart attack was only reduced by 0.41%. However, 0.41 is 54% of 0.76. So although we were led to believe the statin halved the risk of a heart attack, in real terms, it only reduced the risk by less than 1/2 of 1 percentage point. 54% was quoted in the media because of the press release issued by the pharmaceutical company funding the trial. AstraZeneca used relative percentages, and this was simply copied by the world's media. All of the statin trials have used these relative percentages, which give us a distorted view of the benefits associated with statins.
The lead author of that article, the Jupiter study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, actually is a co-owner of the patent of the C-reactive protein. That's the measure that's used that is, if people accept Jupiter, would become a universal screening measure. So you have these press releases that are written, and many of the newspapers in the United States not only picked up the story, but actually editorialized about what a breakthrough it was. And really the only media in the United States that got it right was that renowned medical expert, Stephen Colbert, who said the Jupiter trial was a great breakthrough in figuring out how to get people to take drugs who don't need them.
In 2010, an investigation into the Jupiter trial was published in the Archives of Internal Medicine. This investigation found several other problems with the results of this trial and raised concerns about commercial interests.
We went through healthcare reform in the United States. It was passed in 2010. In the year before healthcare reform was passed, the pharmaceutical industry spent $250 million lobbying Congress. And they had, I think, 15 meetings in the White House that were not publicized. Pharma, which is the trade organization for our pharmaceutical industry, got so much of what it wanted in healthcare reform in the United States that it agreed to spend $100 million advertising in support of healthcare reform. It was so happy with the deal that it negotiated. Well, they spent $250 million to get what they wanted for years and years to come. $250 million is less than 1% of their profit for that year. So with the money that can flow into lobbying and now freely into campaign contributions in the United States, the concentration of capital is so great that there's so much more money than they need to get what they want, that there's not a counterbalance representing the public's interest. So instead of having a dynamic tension between the corporate interests and the public interest, we have an imbalance where the corporate interests get far greater sway over our politicians. And I think what we've got is not a democracy of the people, but we've got a democracy of capital, so that the interests of the insurance industry and the interests of the pharmaceutical industry are, come to some sort of dynamic equilibrium based on their capital. But the public's interest is getting just trounced in this. And because there's so much, the information comes through the airwaves, and the advertising and the public relations that goes on to represent the corporate interest drowns out, even in the media that's trying to do a good job, drowns out the public interest, so that it's almost impossible to get a fair, a balanced view of the whole playing field.
The dynamic tension or counterbalance should be provided by the various health organisations. In the UK, the MHRA is the government organisation responsible for overseeing the safety and effectiveness of medications. And doctors in the UK work to guidelines issued by NICE, who are responsible for looking at the clinical evidence and deciding if medications are cost-effective. We wanted to ask these organisations about the evidence supporting the mass prescription of statins, but both the MHRA and NICE declined our invitation for an interview. We invited the UK government's chief advisor on heart disease, Professor Gray, to take part in this film. However, we did not receive a response. The British Heart Foundation supports the diet heart hypothesis and the widespread use of statins. We contacted the British Heart Foundation for an interview, but they also did not respond. We also contacted the pharmaceutical companies Pfizer and AstraZeneca, who also declined to be interviewed.
Millions of people are employed around it. Food industry is making billions on this idea. Pharmaceutical industry is making billions on this idea. Medical industry is making billions on this idea and employing millions of people based on this idea. They can't suddenly all stop and say we were wrong for all these years, because that would mean far too much for them to lose. They have invested far too much into this idea.
Hopefully, when we look back on this era and we see the fraud that went on in misleading physicians about the scientific evidence, we'll see that this stands as organized crime, that the misrepresentation of science to physicians and to the public stands as organized crime of a higher tech nature than robbing banks with machine guns. But there's a lot more money in this, and in fact, many, many more people get hurt.
Pharmaceutical companies are, of course, a business, and their motivation is to increase profits. They are obliged to increase business growth for their shareholders. This creates a great deal of pressure to develop new products. However, medications take a lot of time and money to develop. In order to develop a new medication, between 5,000 and 10,000 compounds may have to be initially screened. Around 250 of these will enter preclinical testing, with 5 going through to clinical trials on people and 1 as an approved medication. This whole process takes around 10 to 12 years. Developing new products is one way to increase profits, but another way is to increase sales of existing products. Pharmaceutical companies can increase the market size for a medication by investing in the education of doctors and the general public.
So by the time a physician is in practice, he's been taught, very dogmatically by the way, that cholesterol is a villain, that cholesterol and saturated fats cause atherosclerosis. And when they get done with their training and they're out there in practice, they don't change those belief systems very easily.
It makes me angry sometimes. And then I think about all the millions of people out there that are being put on statins, perhaps unnecessarily, in the name of prevention. And maybe we're barking up the wrong tree here.
Pharmaceutical companies, like any other business, are always looking for new markets. more recently by suggesting that children as young as 9 should be screened for high cholesterol. The costs associated with cholesterol medications are not confined to the cost of the drugs themselves and the health costs associated with the adverse effects, but also the lost opportunity to tackle the real causes of heart disease.
What we've done is we've diverted the public's attention, we've diverted physicians' attention by creating these industry-dominated guidelines that cause physicians to pay attention to their patients' cholesterol levels instead of how they're living their lives. The big picture is not only have you not improved people's health as a consequence of taking these pills, but what you've done is you've drained the energy from the healthcare encounters and healthcare efforts away from the things that really will reduce people's risk of heart disease.
Levels of cholesterol change seasonally. They're usually lower in the summer and they're higher in the winter. They change depending on what we're doing, depending on our level of stress, depending on our nutrition, and depending on many, many other factors. The last thing you want to do is to interfere with your blood levels of cholesterol. Your body knows what it's doing. Whatever level of cholesterol you have got at the moment in your bloodstream is the right level for you. Don't mess around with it.
Fully recovered, except for a few minor kinks.
Has he asked for anything special?
Yes, this morning for breakfast, he requested something called wheat germ, organic honey, and tiger's milk.
Oh, yes, those are the charm substances that some years ago were felt to contain life-preserving properties.
You mean there was no deep fat? No steak or cream pies or hot fudge?
Those were thought to be unhealthy. Precisely the opposite of what we now know to be true.
Incredible. Well, he wants to know where he is and what's going on.
I think it's time to tell him.
In the film Sleeper, Woody Allen plays the owner of a health food store who is cryogenically frozen in 1973 and defrosted 200 years later to find, of course, a completely different world. The film is, in some ways, a parody of real life. In 1961, the American physiologist Ancel Keys was depicted on the cover of Time magazine. Ancel Keys was largely responsible for the adoption of the idea that dietary fat causes heart disease. In 1984, Time magazine led with an article informing us about the dangers of cholesterol. Then, in a complete reversal, the June 2014 edition of Time led with a cover story encouraging us to eat butter and explaining how fat was falsely labelled as the enemy. Problems associated with the heart and blood vessels are responsible for 30% of all deaths worldwide. For the last 60 years, our health authorities have believed that dietary saturated fat and cholesterol play a causal role in these deaths.
Yeah, I mean, I think the lipid heart hypothesis, Ancel Keys' original hypothesis from the 50s, still stands up, and in many respects the advent of the statins, highly effective drugs at lowering cholesterol, particularly LDL cholesterol, demonstrate beneficial effects. That fulfills quite a lot of causal requirements. You've got a risk factor, it's consistent, you see it in different places at different times, and when you experimentally lower that risk factor, you see the effect you predict.
However, over the years, numerous contradictions to this belief system have emerged and have been almost completely ignored. One such contradiction has become known as the French paradox.
The paradox has begun to intrigue foreign researchers. Among them, Dr. Kurt Ellison, a cardiologist and professor at the School of Public Health at Boston University.
In this restaurant where I was having lunch, this is something you just wouldn't find in an American restaurant. A Lyonnaise salad bowl, which is pig's head pate with parsley, black pudding, which is very fat, and potatoes in oil. Double fat sliced tripe sauteed with onions, and hot sausage with lentils and potatoes and oil. This is routine stuff.
There's something about the French that seems to be protecting them, and we're not sure what it is we're looking for.
The French paradox also prompted Dr. Malcolm Kendrick to investigate the causes of heart disease in more detail.
I started looking at the figures, and I realised that, well, if you looked at the standard figures, the French had very much the same cholesterol levels. They ate more saturated fat. When you looked at exercise, it was about the same. Body weight, blood pressure, good cholesterol. You took all the conventional risk factors, and the French probably should have a slightly higher rate of heart disease, and yet it was vastly lower. So I thought, you know, there's definitely something not right here. This is not working. I mean, the figures just didn't work.
More recent data confirms that the French are still breaking all the rules. The French still eat more saturated fat than people in the United Kingdom, but have about 1/3 the number of heart disease deaths.
Well, my explanation is, of course, the consumption of alcohol.
There has been for years the belief by doctors in many countries that alcohol, in particular red wine, reduces the risk of heart disease.
That's true. It's also true in America. Well, people who drink red wine in America tend to be middle class, highly educated, have healthy lifestyles. So it's red wine drinking tends to be associated with a certain lifestyle. So this is really just an association that they found. You can find that moderate alcohol consumption protects against heart disease. You'll find that in Spain, you'll find that in Italy, you'll find it in France, you'll find it in any country. Moderate alcohol consumption is protective. Not red wine particularly. Red wine has no obvious advantages over anything else.
France is not the only place we find a paradox. People in Iceland also consume more saturated fat than people in the United Kingdom, but Iceland only has about half the heart disease death rate. In Denmark, people eat less saturated fat than people in Iceland, but the Danes have a higher rate of heart disease deaths. The Portuguese have about 1/3 less saturated fat in their diet than the French, but a higher rate of heart disease deaths. People in Lithuania consume only half as much saturated fat as people in the United Kingdom, but Lithuania has almost double the rate of heart disease deaths. Some authorities say that our saturated fat intake should be below 7% of total calories. Lithuania is almost on target in this respect, but Lithuania has one of the highest heart disease death rates in the world.
Several very recent studies have conclusively demonstrated a lack of any relationship between saturated fat consumption and heart disease.
And questioning the dangers posed by an established threat, saturated fats. A meta-analysis of 72 studies found no convincing evidence that a diet rich in these animal-based fats increased the risk of heart disease. Bruce Griffin is Professor of Nutritional Metabolism at the University of Surrey, and Professor Jeremy Pearson is Medical Director of the British Heart Foundation, who part-funded the research. How convinced are we that there is a direct correlation between saturated fat intake and heart disease? What evidence is out there to convince us of that?
There is enormous amount of evidence. We're pretty confident that there's a strong relationship between saturated fat and blood cholesterol.
Just remind us how convinced you are that raised cholesterol levels lead to increased risk of heart disease and stroke.
Okay, that's incontrovertible as well, I think, in the sense that not only is the association absolutely barred or obvious that if you raise cholesterol, you raise the risk of heart disease. That's all over the world, any population. But also we know that any intervention that lowers cholesterol lowers risk, so the two are directly related and causal.
All three people taking part in this radio programme, including the presenter, already firmly believed that saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease, and no one with the opposite point of view was invited to take part. This particular episode of Inside Health seemed to be just an attempt to explain away an awkward scientific finding that challenged the belief system held by medical opinion leaders. As we've heard, the current belief system suggests any intervention that lowers cholesterol also lowers the risk of heart disease.
When people talk about trying to end heart attacks in the world, or in America at least, one of the ways to do that is to take a look inside the heart, see what's happening before someone ever has a problem. And that's what we're going to do here today. You're actually going to look for what in my heart?
Yes, for calcium, which is part of the atherosclerotic process, the plaques in the heart.
Studies have consistently shown that cholesterol-lowering statins actually increase the amount of calcified plaque in the arteries. Ironic for a drug that's supposed to prevent heart disease. The Veterans Affairs Diabetes trial found that more frequent statin use was associated with accelerated coronary artery calcification. Another study published in the journal Atherosclerosis found that statins also increase the amount of calcified plaque in healthy people without diabetes. And yet another study published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology found similar results. These studies have been quietly ignored by the medical establishment and the mainstream media. However, these important findings were highlighted in a review article written by Professor Sharif Sultan and Dr. Neve Hines in 2013. Professor Sultan is a world-leading vascular and endovascular surgeon. He's Chief of Vascular and Endovascular Surgery at the Galway Clinic in Ireland and Chairman of the Western Vascular Institute. Professor Sultan has over 25 years of vascular experience and gained his qualifications in Egypt, Dublin, Paris, Romania, Switzerland, the United States, and London. His research portfolio has been recognized by 29 international awards, and he's one of the pioneers of minimally invasive endovascular techniques.
Now, the idea is cholesterol causing heart disease is unproven. Cholesterol is crucial for energy, for thyroid function, for sex hormone function, for normal ability of the brain to perform, for all your function in the body to do well. If your cholesterol goes up, that means it's a compensatory mechanism. You cannot drug it with statin.
Professor Sultan told us about numerous case studies where his patients have experienced dramatic improvements in their health by stopping their statin medication.
A nun who runs a big convent, and she suddenly starting forgetting where's the checks, the combination of the safe. She knows everybody by the name. She starts forgetting who's coming and who's going out. She used to control everything, have the keys, have everything. She was working like a Swiss clock. They saw that she has a carotid artery disease, so they sent it to me. CT scan, MRIs, duplex, you name it. Couldn't find anything at all. And again, we start talking to her. And she said, yes, 6 months ago, the GP gave me that medication to lower my cholesterol, who was 5.8. The woman initiative study, done over 150,000 women, shows no evidence in primary prevention with statin for women. She stopped it, she's back running, and every Christmas I have a fantastic card from her thanking me. I didn't do anything, in fact, I've just stopped a tablet. And her life is giving back to her on a golden plate.
We asked Professor Sultan about the reaction to his review article that was heavily critical of the widespread use of statins.
Okay, you know the phrase red, retired and even dangerous. A lot of them like that. They have coalesced in a corner and they don't want to change their mind. However, the young generation well accepted, and they congratulate me on that because the social media have exposed everything. Some of my colleagues supported me like crazy, but some of them tried to discredit the publication. However, they couldn't come back with one single publication that could support their claim, and that's why we call them red.
Professor Jeremy Pearson of the British Heart Foundation states that the relationship between cholesterol and heart disease is consistent all over the world in any population. Of course, the British Heart Foundation is not the only organisation that holds this belief.
Now, to explore the link between saturated fat and heart disease further, the National Heart Foundation Chief Executive, Dr. Lynn Roberts, joins us from Melbourne. Dr. Roberts, thanks very much for taking the time out. Now, a number of cardiologists are adding voices to the call to bust the so-called myth of the role of saturated fat in heart disease. Are you still confident that saturated fat is still the #1 culprit?
We at the Heart Foundation strongly believe that there's
very good evidence from right around the world that shows that saturated fat plays a role in raising blood cholesterol, and of course high blood cholesterol is a risk factor for heart disease.
If we look at the populations already mentioned, we can see that there is not a great deal of difference between the average cholesterol levels for each country, yet the number of heart disease deaths varies greatly. For example, Lithuania and Portugal have roughly the same average cholesterol levels, but Lithuania has more than 4 times the number of heart disease deaths. We might wonder how Professor Jeremy Pearson and other experts could have missed this data challenging the cholesterol hypothesis, especially considering that the data is actually published by the British Heart Foundation themselves. In fact, rather than being consistent all over the world, it's actually difficult to find any country that fits with the saturated fat or cholesterol hypothesis. In Greece, we find another so-called paradox. The island of Crete is steeped in history, being home to the oldest city in Europe and the ancient Minoan civilization. Crete is a popular destination for European holidaymakers during the summer months. But away from the coast, up here in the mountains, there's a village that has been of interest to researchers. The village is called Anogia, and researchers have taken an interest in it because despite eating a high-fat diet, the residents of the village have an extremely low rate of heart disease. Researchers from the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute in Cambridge, United Kingdom, proposed that the villagers are protected from their diet by a rare genetic mutation. Considering the history of Anogia and its people, a genetic link may seem plausible, since the people are known for their strong character and resilience. Anogia has always been heavily involved in the resistance against foreign invaders to the island. As a result, the village was burned down twice by the Turks and then again by the Nazis. After each demolition, the village was rebuilt. The strength and resilience of the people of Anogia is not in question. However, the genetic study was inconclusive. The researchers did find the rare genetic mutation to be much more common in Anogia. However, it was still only present in about 2% of the population. So Anogia remains yet another so-called paradox. Another place that has been of interest to researchers is the island of Sardinia. Sardinia has an unusually high number of people who live to be more than 100 years old. Scientists have highlighted the Barbagia region in particular as being associated with a very long lifespan. The traditional diet of the Barbagia region is known to consist of meat and cheese. Suckling pig is a particular favourite. In 2011, Sardinians called for formal recognition of their diet, insisting that the secret to a long life can be found in their traditional diet of lamb, roast piglet, milk and cheese. The contradictions to the cholesterol hypothesis are not confined to Europe. Japan is another country associated with a low rate of heart disease. For example, the heart disease mortality rate in Japan is about 1/3 to 1/5 of that in the United States. It's often assumed that the Japanese consume a low-fat diet and have low cholesterol levels.
They have increased their saturated fat intake by 200%, and over the last 50 years, their cholesterol level has gone up by about 25 to 30% on average, and their heart disease rate has gone down by 70%. Possibly more extraordinary is that their rate of stroke has gone down by 700%.
Within Japan, some places have an even lower rate of heart disease deaths than the rest of the country. Recent studies have highlighted Fukuoka Prefecture as having a low rate of heart disease deaths even by Japanese standards. Fukuoka is famous for Hakata ramen, a noodle soup covered with thickly sliced fatty pork. Other popular dishes include motsunabe, a kind of hot pot made using beef or pork offal, and yakitori. In general, the food in Fukuoka tends to be fatty and salty, challenging not only the cholesterol hypothesis, but also the idea that dietary salt causes heart disease. Tomohito Hamazaki is Professor Emeritus at the University of Toyama.
more than 15 years ago, I was a guy who believed in cholesterol theory. I was a very strong cholesterol believer. And every time I found a patient with very high cholesterol levels, I persuaded him or her to take statins. I was wrong, but I believed in that theory. Cholesterol is nothing. We Japanese have very high cholesterol levels and still enjoying low rates of coronary heart disease death.
One of the issues that prompted Professor Hamazaki to look again at the cholesterol theory was the link between lower cholesterol levels and increased mortality. In essence, where cholesterol levels are concerned, many studies have shown the higher, the better.
This is the meta-analysis of Japanese 5 reports showing the relationship between cholesterol levels and all-cause mortality. In men, it's just this trend, and in women, there's nothing here, but if your cholesterol levels are very, very low, then your chance to die is bigger than the other groups. Liver cancer and cirrhosis mortality. So if your cholesterol levels are very low, your chance to die from these diseases here. And this is control. So it decreases like this. And look at this. There is no mortality from cirrhosis. Here again, it's liver cancer incidence. So it's just the higher the better. No victims here. Then in women, it's something like this. Let's look at Korean data. This is very good. Over 1 million Korean adults were followed for 14 years. And the y-axis is showing liver cancer incidence. The same here, the same trend here.
Experts who support the idea that lower cholesterol is better are aware of the connection between low cholesterol levels and a shorter lifespan. However, their theory is that it is the disease that causes low cholesterol rather than low cholesterol causing disease, a concept known as reverse causality.
Okay, it happens to a certain degree. Yes, it happens. There's an epidemiological study following people for, let's say, 10 years. And if that kind of reverse causality happens, then let's delete or exclude deaths that happened during the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Then people suffering from serious disease may die away. So just take the latter half of data, then check everything. But usually we still find the relationship between cholesterol and all-cause mortality, and it's the higher the better. That means the reverse causality does not exist to a very significant degree.
The current model of heart disease focuses on several risk factors, often referred to as traditional risk factors, such as high cholesterol, high blood pressure, smoking, diabetes, family history of heart disease, obesity, and age. In 2011, a study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association came up with a surprising result in relation to these risk factors. The researchers looked at 5 of the traditional risk factors in relation to survival after a first heart attack. We might expect to find that those people who didn't survive a first heart attack had more of the traditional risk factors. However, the reverse was true. The more risk factors the person had, the more likely they were to survive a first heart attack. This association between a higher number of risk factors and survival persisted even after adjusting for age and for other clinical factors.
So all these factors correlated with heart disease. If they have those factors high, they're protected. They will live longer. So this is something to me that people should be studying. I mean, it's like, what is wrong? If we've got a model that in these situations is backwards.
That's a complicated issue for several reasons. And they're not dissimilar to what has happened with the cholesterol story.
Some of them do work. Age is probably the most important risk factor, but you can't do anything about that. Being male does carry a greater risk than being female. Smoking is a risk factor. You know, having diabetes. So some of these are definitely, you know, they're correct. But the ones that most people probably hear about, your cholesterol level, your blood pressure, they don't fit.
What is considered to be normal cholesterol has progressively gone down. So you can sell more drugs. The exact same thing is true for hypertension. 120/80 used to be considered normal. Now it's pre-hypertension. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, well, when you talk about hypertension, what are you talking about? What do you consider normal?
We know there are many papers showing positive association between blood pressure and coronary heart disease. So then people interpret that the hypertension is a risk factor. The hypertension could be the consequence of the progress of atherosclerosis. By raising blood pressure, our body are keeping to supply nutrient and oxygen to the peripheral tissue.
Blood pressure is kind of like cholesterol. Is very often it's not the problem itself. It's the body's response to the problem. And the purpose of a raised blood pressure is to supply more blood to areas that might need it.
If you lower blood pressure, you will lower your risk for stroke. But you will not prospectively lower your chances of getting a heart attack or developing atherosclerosis.
I think there's almost no chance to increase life expectancy by using blood pressure lowering drugs.
Well, everyone thinks that obesity is about how much fat you carry. And at least from a definition standpoint, that makes sense because we define obesity on the basis of this thing called BMI, body mass index, which is how much do you weigh versus how tall you are. So in that sense, they're right. The question is that definition even appropriate? When you stand on the scale, what are you measuring? Well, you're measuring 4 compartments at once. You're measuring bone, you're measuring muscle, you're measuring subcutaneous or big butt fat, and then finally the visceral fat, the belly fat. Well, it turns out that that visceral fat is only 4 to 6% of your total body weight. So when you stand on the scale, what are you measuring? You don't know. You can't know. So the concept of using BMI as a method for determining obesity and risk for disease makes perfect sense in populations where everything regresses to the mean. But for individuals, BMI is, for lack of a better word, it's garbage.
The biggest change in my lifetime looking after people is that when I came into medicine, the patient came to us with a complaint or a problem, and we tried to sort it out. In the 1960s, 70s, 80s, gradually the whole game changed that in such a way that we were trying to treat people to stop them getting problems, to stop them getting their heart attacks and their strokes in particular. So you've got the matter of treating risk.
If you've heard it once from your doctor, you've probably heard it 1,000 times. Know your numbers. Blood pressure, your BMI. And how about your bad cholesterol level?
Okay, but if you're treating risk, there are certain things you need to know. What is the risk? What is the benefit of treatment? And who benefits from that treatment?
Okay, prediction is like a stock market. You're going to get an actuarial finance guy who'll sit and predict here what's going to happen in the stock market. That pooled estimate of actuarial futuring in patient doesn't apply. The reason for that, human beings aren't numbers.
Despite the problems with the current risk factor-based approach, it is this model that is used by doctors all over the world as the primary tool to decide who should be medicated.
In an important medical story for Americans tonight, heart doctors are putting out controversial new guidelines for preventing heart disease.
So rather than adjusting the statin dose to reach a certain cholesterol level, the panel now advises doctors to prescribe either a moderate or high dose depending upon the patient's risk factors for cardiovascular disease.
Statins are already taken by millions of people. Their use has quadrupled in the past decade, with 60 million prescriptions a year in England now. GPs currently offer statins to patients who have a 20% risk of a heart attack or stroke in the next 10 years. NICE wants to lower the threshold to 10%, so many more people will end up taking statins.
So is that a form of prevention?
Yeah, that's quite correct, Matt. What's worked out through these calculators, which we've been using in Australia now for a number of years, is adding up all those risk factors, as was mentioned in the previous report, to determine what is your risk of having a heart attack or a stroke in the next 5 years.
We have an update tonight on last week's story about the new guidelines for cholesterol and who should take statins to reduce the risk of heart disease. The guidelines were put out by the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology, but tonight there are questions about the formula or the calculator that they used.
Paul Ritger and Nancy Cook of Brigham and Women's Hospital looked at published studies of patients with cardiovascular disease and say the new calculator significantly overestimates the risk. The calculator may suggest statin treatment for about twice as many middle-aged Americans as actually may significantly benefit from it.
One of the recent articles showed that 12 out of the 15 panel group are affiliated with the industry.
The drug industry buys influential doctors, and these doctors are allowed to sit in guideline committees, although most countries have laws of public administration that says otherwise. We also accept it in my country, so I have complained to the Danish Ombudsman about this, that our National Board of Health is not living up to our law of public administration because they use these conflicted doctors, and the guidelines get influenced by having conflicted doctors sitting there. And then you have a big problem in general practice because they are supposed to follow these guidelines.
The guideline of Atherosclerosis Society in Japan, published in 2012. Okay. At first, I looked for information of COI. I was very much disappointed. They didn't write it at all. Okay, next year. This is a sister book of this one. Okay, and this is also published from JAS. And it says treatment guide for dyslipidemia. Okay, I tried to find COI information again. Yes, I found it. The very first page, yeah, they wrote COI information here. Okay, this one is just for the rules of disclosing COI. And this part is just a list of Japanese pharmaceutical companies and medical equipment companies and publishers. Where are authors of this guideline? Nobody's here. So just a list of companies. Is this COI information? I don't think so. So we do not understand which researcher is getting fund of money or something from which company. No, nothing at all. Just a list of companies. And it says COI. Well, you can laugh it. Laugh at this. But to be honest, I'm not sure to laugh at it or to cry.
Studies have shown that if you ask a doctor to estimate how much benefit they're giving a patient by giving them a certain treatment for blood pressure or cholesterol or blood glucose, they will overestimate. If you actually look at the real figures in terms of the number of people whose lives would be affected by this treatment, you come up with answers where many people in the street would say, well, okay, fair enough, but forget it. I'm not interested in that level of risk.
I'm 61. I've got a predicted risk of having a heart attack over the next 10 years of about 10%, which puts me in the frame now for potentially needing to take or being offered a statin. So at that sort of level, a 10% risk over 10 years, 2 people are going to benefit out of 100, 98 will not get any benefit. So in terms of the amount of treatment you have to mete out to a population for the return that you get in terms of events avoided is small, but it's almost certainly not a fluke, not due to chance, it's a real effect.
It is not the cholesterol lowering effect, because the statin drugs have many other effects. For instance, they inhibit the coagulation system. No trial has ever shown an association between the degree of cholesterol lowering and the effect on the treatment. I mean, if high cholesterol was the real cause, then those people whose cholesterol went down very much should have more benefit than those whose cholesterol was unchanged. But this is not the case. The effect is the same whether they have normal or very high cholesterol.
The 2% of people who will benefit specifically refers to benefits associated with cardiovascular disease. However, none of the clinical trials done on statins have shown any benefit in terms of deaths from all causes. In other words, people do not live any longer when they take a statin as a preventative measure. This indicates that the unknown adverse effects of the statin are counteracting the small cardiovascular benefit. Although the individual clinical trials have included thousands of people, there has been a suggestion that larger data sets are required in order to demonstrate an increase in life expectancy.
One of the difficulties is that when you do primary prevention trials, not many people die, okay? Which means that you need big numbers to detect small effects. Any individual trial is bound by what is a reasonable amount of money, time, energy, patience to conduct, and that is the virtue of systematic reviews where you put lots of trials together.
Almost all of the systematic reviews of statins have also failed to show any increase in life expectancy when the medication is given to people who do not have heart disease. In 2011, Professor Ebrahim and colleagues published a Cochrane review of statins, which was one of these systematic reviews. Cochrane is one of the most respected research organizations in the world. The organization itself is free from commercial sponsorship. After completing the Cochrane review, Professor Ebrahim stated, "If you look at the hard endpoints of all deaths and coronary deaths, the effects are consistent with both benefit and with the play of chance. The absolute benefits are really rather small. 1,000 people have to be treated for 1 year to prevent 1 death. It means a lot of people have to be treated to gain this small benefit. As we don't know the harms, it seems wrong-minded to me to treat everyone with a statin." Then, in 2013, the Cochrane review was updated, and this time the authors were in favor of the widespread use of statins, concluding reductions in all-cause mortality, major vascular events, and revascularizations were found with no excess of adverse events. The authors also said that the widespread use of statins is likely to be cost-effective. So, why the change of heart?
I think you're misreading the earlier version. There was no doubt that statins had beneficial effects. The concerns we had was that at that time, the reporting of the adverse unintended consequences of statins was poor, which made it difficult in the primary prevention setting to be fulsome support for their use, and we said they should be used with some caution. If you're looking at the overall total mortality, and that's what life expectancy is giving you, a translated estimate of total mortality, you're seeing a small, but, and again, probably real effect, but a small effect because of the many other causes that are involved. If you look at it in terms of death rates, all-cause mortality rates, there's been some confusion about this in the literature recently. My reading of the trials is that people on statins, the all-cause mortality rates are lower in people on statins.
And the best estimate that we have, again, what are the actual numbers? What was the absolute risk reduction in all-cause mortality? Or how much longer can someone expect to live in primary prevention by taking a statin?
Well, the data weren't presented in that sort of way. We see actually a small reduction in all-cause mortality on statins, which is consistent with the reduction in the coronary heart disease events that have been reduced.
So if statins in primary prevention do increase life expectancy, where does that evidence come from?
Well, we can't get strong estimates of life expectancy with the trials because they're short. So we can extrapolate from those. But essentially we've got trials that run for 5, 7, 10 years. We've got long-term follow-ups on some of the trials. And the benefits of the statins seem to be prolonged.
But what report, what trial, where is the actual evidence? Because you've said that they do increase life expectancy. So what reference, what report can someone look at to?
I think the best summary estimates still come from the cholesterol treatment trialists collaboration report, the 2012 Lancet report.
Now, they did a review in 2012 which apparently turned everything on its head and said that yes, statins were beneficial in primary prevention and at very low levels of risk. At that point, all the other groups in the world, even the Cochrane collaboration who said primary prevention is pointless, the benefits are minute. Then the CTT came out, where the Cochrane collaboration changed their minds completely, 180 degree shift. Now I have concerns about the CTT research because firstly they won't show their data to anyone.
Well, we have indeed seen a small effect on people who already have had a heart attack. But I am a little skeptical to the results because it is not possible to get access to the primary data.
They've signed agreements with pharmaceutical companies that they won't release the data. So we're relying on them alone.
What we now know from experience gained over the last 20 years or so is that it would be a much better place for the industry and for patients and for those of us trying to make sense of the data if all that data were available.
And all these trials have been performed and paid by the drug industry, the same industry that produce the drug they are testing on patients. It's not a good idea.
So we're essentially relying on the pharmaceutical companies to have provided all the data required and for the CTT to have done an analysis on that, upon which rests all of the advice for the use of statins around the world. I don't think that's a good situation to be in, because the cholesterol trialist collaboration is also a part of another unit called the CTSU in Oxford, which is the Clinical Trials Service Unit, which essentially runs multi-million pound studies on behalf of the pharmaceutical industry. So I think there are dangers here of significant conflicts of interest which have not really been addressed, and I think they ought to be.
95% of research done on statin is funded by the multinational. And that's the problem. A big multinational comes in, spend a couple of billions on a trial, and then tell you that it's good. Nobody trusts that anymore. We've been burned few times to the extent that whatever result any multinational going to get, we do not trust.
It is a very bizarre situation because if I was accused of something in a court case and I came up in court with 15 meters of documents and told the judge, this is all the evidence there is in my case, I have collected it myself, please tell me if I'm guilty or not, I might be thrown out of court. But this is the system we have created for the drug industry. And we must think about the fact that the difference between an honest data analysis and a not so honest data analysis can actually be worth billions of dollars or euros on the world market.
Remember, the stock market depends on a lot of this multinational. However, my patients are the most important. I don't care about the stock market. I care about my patient.
The influence of the pharmaceutical companies is everywhere. They have their tentacles everywhere. And they try to, I'm sorry for this expression, but that's true, they try to bribe every type of person they can. And there are examples that they have bribed every type of person there is, including ministers of health. So the money is everywhere. The drug industry systematically buys doctors. They buy their loyalty by putting thousands of them on their advisory boards or as consultants, or they lecture for drug companies, which is also bad because education of doctors should have nothing to do with drug companies. And in this way, they buy loyalty among doctors. So doctors won't protest too much if they are told that they cannot get access to the data they collected themselves in clinical trials and check whether the data analysis performed by the drug companies are okay. There are many, many ways you can look at the same data set, and there are also always uncertainties and ambiguities, and you need to make up your mind. Was this a heart attack or wasn't it a heart attack, and so on. And then you can analyze the data in lots of different ways when you have decided who had an event and who didn't have an event. So it is really possible to massage your data until they tell you what you want to hear. And I have seen that many times over my career, where things that were published in the major journals in this world were simply untrustworthy when we, in rare cases, got access to the data through lawsuits or through drug agencies.
After the first Cochrane review, the authors highlighted these issues concerning the commercial sponsorship of clinical trials, and in a press release stated that all but one of the trials they reviewed were industry-sponsored. The lead researcher, Dr. Fiona Taylor, stated, "We know that industry-sponsored trials are more likely to report favorable results for drugs versus placebos, so we have to be cautious about interpreting these results." However, these concerns seem to have disappeared after the second review, which used even more pharmaceutical company-sponsored data than the first review. We asked Professor Ibrahim if he's concerned about problems associated with the commercial interests.
It's an inevitability that trials are commissioned by pharmaceutical industries, occasionally in partnership with non-commercial sponsors. And I think if you look at the integrity of the research groups that have been doing the trials, it would be hard to imagine that any industry hand had been involved in those analyses. They're not the sort of analyses that come out of anything other than a very skilled academic group of researchers. The Oxford group have invested a lot of time, a lot of money has been spent on setting up that individual patient database with a very large number of randomised trials included in it, industry-sponsored, and I think they've done an incredibly good job of the analysis of that data.
The Clinical Trial Service Unit is run by Professor Sir Rory Collins. Professor Collins has been heavily critical of anyone who questions the benefits of statins. He's also tried to use his influence to have scientific papers that are critical of his research removed from the British Medical Journal. We requested an interview with Professor Collins to discuss the evidence for the widespread use of statins. Initially, Professor Collins agreed to this, then 2 days later declined our invitation. Pharmaceutical companies are not the only sponsors of the Clinical Trial Service Unit. The British Heart Foundation also gives them money. We wanted to ask the British Heart Foundation about their support for the CTSU and the clinical evidence for the widespread use of statins. After a brief exchange of emails, they also declined our invitation to take part.
There is not one single trial that have proven that statin works in primary prevention.
We are all going to die, and if we don't have some certainty that by taking a drug for decades we will expect to live longer, and when we don't know really what the harms are, because they are always badly reported, then we have a problem.
This kind of guideline is of the big pharma, by the big pharma, and for the big pharma. It's crazy.
Heart disease has historically been thought of as a disease of affluence, the basic idea being that wealthier people can afford to be lazy and eat an unhealthy diet. However, the World Health Organization estimates that more than 80% of all cardiovascular disease deaths occur in low and middle-income countries. Heart disease is also often thought of as a modern disease, being associated with contemporary food choices and lifestyles. Although there are established links with certain lifestyle factors, heart disease is certainly not something new. In 1911, a great pioneer of paleopathology, Sir Mark Armand Ruffer, described the presence of arterial plaques in Egyptian mummies. Many years later, researchers became intrigued by a sign displayed inside the Cairo Museum stating that ancient Egyptians suffered from heart disease just like present-day humans. To investigate this further, researchers formed the Horus study. This involved a multidisciplinary team of cardiologists, Egyptologists, radiologists, and molecular biologists. During the first stage of the study, using CT scans, the researchers confirmed the presence of atherosclerosis in ancient Egyptian mummies. Then the researchers extended the study to include mummies from 3 other regions of the world, spanning 4,000 years of human history. Evidence of atherosclerosis was found in individuals from all populations studied. Our ancient ancestors, of course, didn't smoke cigarettes, didn't have fast food, and were probably more physically active than we are today, yet they were still susceptible to the buildup of plaque within arteries. Unfortunately, we have no idea how common heart disease was at that time, or if the arterial plaques correlated with any specific lifestyle factors. However, these findings do tell us that heart disease is not exclusively caused by the standard Western diet, and that the processes associated with heart disease have been part of the human condition for a very long time. So how can we untangle the many paradoxes into a more coherent understanding of the causes of heart disease? There's a natural inclination to look at the healthiest populations and try to emulate the aspects of their nutrition and lifestyles that seem to promote longevity. However, this is only half the story. In order to gather as many clues as possible, we should also look at those populations who suffer from the most ill health. Where heart disease is concerned, one of the most striking and consistent findings can be seen in the hierarchy of societies.
People with a low income have a much higher risk of dying of heart disease. For example, in England, men in the lowest socioeconomic group are almost 3 times more likely to die of heart disease than men in the highest socioeconomic group. We might expect, therefore, that there are more people with high cholesterol in the lowest socioeconomic group. However, the reverse is true. The lowest socioeconomic group have fewer people with high cholesterol. Women in England, in the lowest socioeconomic group, are 5 times more likely to die of heart disease than women in the highest socioeconomic group, but have approximately the same number of people with high cholesterol.
Although cholesterol levels are not higher in the socioeconomic groups that suffer the most heart disease, other factors sometimes are. In the UK, the lower socioeconomic groups tend to have more people who smoke, more central obesity, and more diabetes. So could the increased risk associated with a lower status in society be explained by some of these traditional risk factors? This is what researchers from the University of California wanted to know. Their investigation concluded that changes in the traditional risk factors could not account for the increased risk, and a lower socioeconomic status is somehow an independent risk factor in itself. In Australia, we also find a clear correlation between a lower socioeconomic status and an increased risk of heart disease. Here, people in the lowest socioeconomic group have twice as many heart disease deaths as those in the highest socioeconomic group. Although the same trend is seen as in England, the heart health inequality is much less pronounced in Australia than it is in England. It's a complicated picture, but the difference might be explained by the fact that Australia has considerably more social mobility. In a study that included 34 developed countries, Australia was one of the best in terms of prospects for social mobility, and Great Britain was among the worst.
Well, there's a Michael Marmot who was in charge of running the Whitehall study, which is a very long-term study going on in civil servants in London, and has demonstrated very clearly that your position in the social hierarchy of that organisation, so the top people, top professionals, and then you go down to more junior clerking staff, but as you move up the social ladder, your risk of heart disease falls down.
The Whitehall study is a famous study that demonstrated that the amount of stress that people were under predicted their demise and their susceptibility to these chronic metabolic diseases.
So position in social hierarchy is very important.
Many of the countries having the most heart disease deaths also tend to have high levels of societal stress. We've already seen that Lithuania has one of the highest rates of heart disease deaths in the world, despite having very low saturated fat consumption. Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, is a popular tourist destination. The medieval old town is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and architecturally one of the most interesting cities in Europe. Vilnius is also of great historical significance for the Catholic religion. However, away from the historical old town, the challenges that Lithuania has faced in the past are also visible. Although the economy is now improving, Lithuania has experienced many societal and economic challenges caused by several changes in governance over a relatively short period of time. Lithuania has been under the control of the Polish, Nazi Germany, and the former Soviet Union, gaining independence in 1991 after large demonstrations across the country. And today, Lithuania is a member of the European Union.
After the breakdown of the Soviet Union, people's pensions disintegrated, they lost jobs. Although communism and the communist state was not seen as a utopia, compared to what happened afterwards, there was just utter breakdown. People despaired. They lost everything. The huge stresses on them at that time. And there are mechanisms that you can look at as to why that ends up causing heart disease. Western medicine, if you want to call it that, or reductionist medicine, has kind of said, well, there's the mind and the body, the two aren't connected in any way, and they've dismissed stress as a possible cause of heart disease. However, I started looking at this many years ago and I said, well, how can it? What is going on? One of the first signs of damage is that the system becomes inflexible. So, for instance, when children are being born, there's a heart rate monitor goes on to the mother's tummy and it measures the fetal heart rate. Now, the most dangerous sign is when the heart rate stops going up and down, is when it flattens. When it flattens, that child's in trouble and it needs to get out, and that's when they do emergency cesarean section. Something's going horribly wrong. And you can actually measure heart rate variability. It requires a bit more sensitive machinery because the difference is smaller to the naked eye, but you can see the heart rate, when it's variable, when it's hunting, when it's going up and down, is a sign of a healthy heart. And in fact, once you lose heart rate variability, your risk of premature mortality is enormously raised. mean, by far more than any other risk factor I've ever seen. A study in Finland demonstrated that after 10 years, this is in elderly people when they start, 65 years old, 10 years later, if you had good heart rate variability, your chances of being alive were 80. 10 years later was 80%. If you had poor heart rate variability, your chances of being alive 10 years later was 20%. That is a 60% absolute difference in mortality. You will not find any other variable that will give you anything within a tenfold factor of that. It's just a huge difference.
Low heart rate variability is a bad indicator of heart disease risk, and the heart rate, I think the heart rate becomes very little variability because the system can't handle that kind of dramatic change.
In diabetes, it's considered you develop frank diabetes when your insulin production is just burnt out, inflexible and gone. So you're producing quite a lot of insulin, but it's failing to respond. So again, systems, if you can measure systems that lose flexibility, you're measuring an ill, unhealthy system.
Cortisol is our stress hormone. Cortisol helps our cells adapt to various stressors. In the old days, stressors were physical stressors like running away from lions and injury and what have you. And what cortisol did was it held on to salt, and it also created more sugar so that cells had more energy available to them, particularly in times of starvation. So cortisol is our stress hormone, and we need cortisol. But we also need cortisol to go back down once the stress is over. The problem is we are now all under chronic stress. Our maladaptive society has now created chronic stress. And that chronic stress also raises cortisol, but it never goes down.
And what happens to people is if that becomes burnt out, it becomes flat. So you get this kind of very flattened picture. So once that system starts to go wrong, once that system begins to become flattened and damaged, you can see a whole spectrum of abnormalities coming out of that. You can become insulin resistant, you can become diabetic, you can become centrally obese, you can develop high VLDL levels, your blood pressure goes up.
Cortisol helps deposit the energy into visceral, belly fat, as opposed to subcutaneous or butt fat, if you will. And that belly fat is much more dangerous in terms of that insulin resistance and driving that chronic metabolic disease. And cortisol is a specific instigator of that phenomenon.
It's done by a researcher called Bjorn Torp, who did a lot of this work and showed loss of flexibility of cortisol secretion was a really major important sign of developing heart disease, cancer, in fact almost all diseases. We see people who are chronically stressed, people with fibromyalgia have high or abnormal or flattened cortisol secretion. They also die of heart disease and cancer. If you give people cortisol artificially, as in steroids, they develop the entire same spectrum of symptoms and they die of heart disease.
The fact is we have numerous pieces of data that show us that glucocorticoids or cortisol, drive these chronic metabolic diseases.
In the body, cortisol is secreted via the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis. In essence, when the brain perceives stress or a threat, it sends a signal to the adrenal glands, which in turn produce more cortisol. The effects that cortisol has on metabolic function and the activation of the HPA axis causes a cascade of physiological changes that can increase the risk of heart disease.
So if you look at people, for instance, who've suffered post-traumatic stress disorder and you measure what's going on in their brains, their hypothalamic, their HPA axis is shot to hell. It doesn't work anymore. They don't respond the same as you or I would to stress. Sometimes something that wouldn't bother us, the whole system lights up. Other times it shuts down. They've got a flattened system. And these people are far more likely to die of heart disease at a young age. So I'm not sure which of these metabolic problems is the key one, but one of the possibly the most important one is your increase in your clotting in your blood. Your blood becomes much more ready to clot, which makes sense. If cortisol's a stress hormone, when you're stressed, you're in a fight or flight response. When you're in a fight, you don't want to bleed profusely if you're injured, so your coagulation system is fired up. And we know that the underlying cause of heart disease, well, the final terminal event in heart disease and a stroke, is the development of a blood clot, a thrombus, which blocks an artery and causes a heart attack. Now, some people believe, and I also believe, that you have these events going on, non-terminal events, clotting going on in your arteries quite a lot, where that's when the artery first narrows, and then another one goes on top and on top and on top. So repeated coagulation is a very dangerous position to be in. We can see that people who become dehydrated become more ready for their blood to clot, and this is when heart attacks very often happen. So we have potentially this is the underlying mechanism, I think, that's of significance.
Of course, stress can also be positive and beneficial. Many people thrive in a stimulating and challenging environment, and many of the fun things in life could technically be called stressful. However, chronic negative stress, often associated with a lack of control over life's events, has far-reaching health consequences. In addition, stress is very much an individual thing. It depends on what we as individuals find stressful. In the 1996 Football European Championships, there was a very close-fought match played between France and the Netherlands. The match went to penalty kicks, and France won. On the day of the match, there was a statistically significant increase in heart attacks and strokes in men in the Netherlands, but not in women. The wrong kind of stress can also accelerate the aging process and shorten our telomeres, which are the caps protecting our DNA. There's also a strong association between shorter telomeres and a significantly increased risk of heart disease, and more recent studies have shown that a poor socioeconomic environment can shorten telomere length. We don't yet know if the shorter telomeres actually cause heart disease directly, or if they're part of the overall condition. However, these findings further support a coherent argument for stress and psychological factors being a major cause of heart disease.
Stress is like cyanide for your body. The more you get stressed, the more you're killing yourself. Accumulation of stress, like accumulation of toxins inside your body, it will end you with diabetes mellitus, with heart attack and cancer. And there's a lot of ways to avoid stress. Most importantly is to change your life. If you don't like your job, but it's paying the bills, change your life. Do not stay still. You cannot fly except when you spread your wings. Whether a job, whether a partner, a car, whether anything, you have to change it. You have to relieve that stress by any means.
The many physiological effects that chronic stress has on the body can also compromise the immune system, which leads to another potential cause of heart disease.
If you are chronically stressed, you are at a much higher risk of being infected. What all agree about is that the start, it is a small bubble localized on the inside of the arterial wall, and when this bubble rupture, its content goes out into the artery, and it starts the coagulation process, and it may end up with a total blockage of the artery. Nobody has ever been able to explain how does this bubble, we call it the vulnerable plaque, how does it start? Why is it created in the arteries? Nobody has been able to explain it, but what we have explained, Kilmer, Macaulay and I, is the mechanism. We think that the detrimental event is that these capillaries on the outside of the arteries, they are blocked by something. They could be blocked by stress, they could be blocked by a substance called homocysteine. But what we think is a real cause is clumps of bacteria and viruses and lipoproteins. Because what very few people know, even researchers inside this area, is that the lipoproteins, LDL, for instance, they participate in the immune system by attaching to all kinds of bacteria and virus and inactivate them. And it's a very effective system. It takes seconds, and normally this take place in the wound, in a damaged wound that had been infected. But if the immune system is imperfect, these clumps, bacteria and virus clumps, clumped together by the lipoproteins, may come into the circulation, and they may be so large that they have difficulties passing the small capillaries in the arterial wall. In particular in the arterial wall, because the pressure outside these capillaries is very high in an artery, whereas in a vein it's very low. So we think that here the capillaries may be blocked by these clumps of bacteria and viruses. When they occlude the capillaries in the arterial wall, a small part of the arterial wall will die, and instead it will be filled with bacteria and viruses, and in this way they will cause a small blister in the arterial wall. And when this blister open, then we have a catastrophe. There are many observations that are in accord with our hypothesis. Firstly, the symptoms with acute heart disease, they are very similar to an infectious disease. Most people with heart disease, at least the major heart disease, they got fever, the number of leukocytes, white blood cells in the blood, they go up, sedimentation rate goes up. These are the same symptoms as we see in infectious diseases. In serious heart attacks, you will also find an increased number of bacteria in the blood. Many other factors interact here. For instance, lack of vitamins, lack of vitamin C, lack of vitamin D, increase the risk of infections. The concentration of vitamin C inside the white blood cells is 80 times higher than in the blood, which means that it must have an important function in the white blood cells. Stress is certainly increase the risk of infection. All factors that influence our immune system in a negative way, they may provoke cardiovascular disease.
So, rather than being caused by artery-clogging fats and cholesterol, heart disease could more accurately be described as a clotting process. This clotting process involves the potential interaction of stress, the immune system, nutritional imbalances, and environmental factors, each potential cause having more or less importance depending on each individual person's unique set of circumstances. This has huge implications for the system that is currently in place. Most of the real causes of heart disease cannot be assessed by using a simple risk calculator. The use of this calculator serves the purposes of the pharmaceutical industry. And in countries like the UK, it's also used as a performance-related pay scheme for doctors. For some patient groups, doctors are paid more money if they drive their patients' cholesterol levels down. Despite decades of research, there is no actual evidence to show that lower cholesterol levels are healthier. In fact, the more we learn about cholesterol, the more we begin to appreciate its ability to protect us from serious diseases and infections and promote longevity. Experts who support the widespread use of cholesterol-lowering statins routinely tell us that the benefits of these medications far outweigh the risks. They tell us this through statements issued to the media, often through press releases. However, when asked to justify their claims, they are ominously silent. The organizations that we are supposed to be able to trust choose to ignore their own data and instead go along with the current system that is heavily rigged in favor of the drugs companies.
There should be changes all over the place. We need a revolution. It's not enough with reforms because the whole system is so rotten that we need a revolution. And one of the first things is that doctors should look at themselves in the mirror and ask themselves, can I really defend accepting money from a corrupt industry, which business model is organized crime that has caused the death of hundreds of thousands of patients over the years. Can I really accept to get money from an industry like that? I think the answer is very simple. You must say no.